Welcome to Archival. I'm your host, Juanita Tolliver, and today we're sticking with the archives featuring the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But I'm specifically zooming in on examples of the Bureau's efforts to surveil and impede members of the press through harassment and intimidation tactics. In the everlasting information battle, journalists have taken on the task of covering abuses of power in real time, and sometimes those in power have lashed out at them in response. And I'm not even referring to the FBI's search of a Washington Post reporter's home in Virginia on January 14th, 2026. That search and seizure appears to be an extension of the playbook established by J. Edgar Hoover and perpetuated by presidents across time that centers on the targeted harassment and probing that I'll be exploring in this episode. To give you a sense of just how far back in time I'll be taking you today, the files and records I've explored in the archives range from 1942 to 1973 and include experiences of Cliff McKay and Daniel Shore, journalists who dared to question the U.S. government and its leaders. Plus, listen to the full episode for my favorite segment, One Last Nugget, to hear how the tables were turned and the FBI got robbed. This is Archival. On July 5th, 1942, columnist and editor of the Atlanta Daily World, Cliff McKay, published a piece entitled, "Now Just Who is Subversive?" as a direct question and call-out of J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI agents who, by this point, had made 2 unannounced visits to his newspaper's office. The Atlanta Daily World was one of the first Black daily newspapers in the United States. And thanks to the archives housed at the University of Georgia Digital Libraries, I was able to see in print McKay's direct statements to J. Edgar Hoover. McKay wrote, quote, "Twice now, agents of this ace organization, the FBI, have seen fit to visit the writer's office in the course of their routine check on what Negroes are doing and thinking. One gathers, after the conversation, that some white people would like to read sedition and subversive activity into the determination of Negroes to achieve democracy here. At the same time, they are called upon to fight for its preservation abroad." Nothing could be further from the truth, as these FBI agents were told on both occasions of their visits. So what prompted these casual drop-ins by FBI field agents? Simply put, J. Edgar Hoover was paranoid. He, and thus the FBI, was afraid of Black people demanding their civil rights during World War II, and whether or not Black people were engaging with communists. One letter to the editor that caused a spike in Hoover's paranoia was submitted by James Thompson to the Pittsburgh Courier and printed on January 31st, 1942. Thompson raised a simple question: should I sacrifice to live half American? And he suggested a double victory: a victory against the Axis forces and a victory against segregation and Jim Crow on the home front. Here's how the letter to the editor was described in the 1999 PBS documentary, The Black Press: Soldiers Without Swords.
James Thompson, a cafeteria worker from Wichita, Kansas, suggested in a letter to the Pittsburgh Courier that African Americans use the war overseas to press for change in their own backyard.
Should I sacrifice my life to live half American? Will things be better for the next generation in the peace to follow? Let we colored Americans adopt the double V for a double victory. The first V for victory over our enemies from without. The second V for victory over our enemies from within.
The Double V campaign took off, and public support was reflected in Black people doing the Double V hand gesture, Double V designs on dresses and necklines, and there was even a Double V song. The community was bought in, and naturally, the demand for access to democracy and civil rights was the last thing that the U.S. government and the military wanted to deal with, especially during World War II. They wanted compliant soldiers, not free-thinking Black people demanding more and better. Since the notion of a double victory had been planted and spreading across the nation via black newspapers, Hoover decided that those newspapers had to be stopped. Cue the visits to newsrooms by FBI agents and questions to editors of black newspapers across the nation. According to a 1986 paper presented by Patrick Washburn, associate professor at Ohio University and historian, the first known FBI visit to a black newspaper during World War II was January 27th, 1942 in Atlanta, Georgia. An FBI agent visited the offices of the Atlanta Daily World to speak to Cliff McKay and question him about communications with the Orient News Service and the Communist Party. Washburn also noted that FBI memos from April 1942 indicated that Hoover wrote a letter to the editor of the Birmingham World, Emory Jackson, complaining about a column McKay wrote questioning why Hoover did not hire black FBI agents. Jackson expressed an interest in meeting during an upcoming trip to Washington, D.C., and on April 23, 1942, he met with an FBI agent at the U.S. Capitol. While it's unclear what was said during that meeting, after that singular conversation, Hoover wrote again to Jackson and thanked him for, quote, understanding the FBI's point of view. Hoover also stated that he instructed local agents to communicate with Jackson. This is what made it abundantly clear that control was the name of the game. Hoover wanted the editors to stop their calls for a double victory and stop writing about discrimination, segregation, and racism, even though that was reality. And Hoover's FBI agents visited editors at the California Eagle, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Norfolk Journal and Guide, and Southern newsrooms. Things in the South became so concerning that a Texas publisher wrote, quote, the FBI has frightened all of the Negro editors in the Southland. The other prong of Hoover's playbook included incessantly collecting copies of the black newspapers and asking DOJ attorneys to comb through them for violations of the Espionage Act, including sedition. He was building a case by intimidating black editors, and what's most unfortunate is that Franklin D. Roosevelt signed off on it. Here's how Frank Bolden, a black journalist who was called before a Congressional Select Committee investigation, described Hoover's dynamic with Roosevelt.
Now, Edgar Hoover decided that the black press was dangerous to America's well-being in the war, and he did all within his power to accuse them of sedition. Hoover had the presidency ear, he had the ear of almost every president, and Roosevelt was no exception. Roosevelt was gullible. He was a fine president, but he was gullible. He didn't have the guts. Just tell Hoover no. The word no. All he had to do, J. Edgar Hoover, say, what part of no don't you understand?
The only U.S. government officials who impeded Hoover's efforts to charge black journalists were the DOJ attorneys who informed him that members of the press were protected by the First Amendment, and Attorney General Francis Biddle, though Biddle wasn't exactly out front on this issue. A 1998 New York Times Magazine profile of the editor of the Chicago Defender, John H. Singstrack, described how, after Hoover threatened charges of sedition, Singstrack led a delegation of black editors to Washington, D.C., and he confronted Biddle, saying, quote, if you want to close us, go ahead and attempt it. I mean, those are strong words for the 1940s because Biddle did not in fact try it, and Hoover was forced to stand down. But it didn't end there for the FBI and Hoover. If anything, the World War II push for control and censorship was effectively a precursor for what became COINTELPRO. The counterintelligence program focused on exposing, disrupting, misdirecting, and discrediting black civil rights organizers, anti-war activists, and feminist leaders that I mentioned in the last episode. This push in the 1940s was merely a warm-up act. And considering that Hoover outlasted 7.5 presidents in his 48-year tenure, he had a lot of room to deploy his nefarious tactics. And yes, Nixon was that 0.5 of a president. More on that in a second. Are you familiar with Richard Nixon's enemies list? Yes, I know. It's giving Mean Girls burn book energy for presidents. And of course, anger and retribution isn't a new concept, especially for a president who enjoys abusing his power. But there was a uniquely long, detailed paper trail and cache of audio recordings of President Nixon and his enemies list, including this moment on December 14th, 1972.
The press is the enemy. The press is the enemy. The press is the enemy. The establishment is the enemy. The professors are the enemy. The professors are the enemy. Write that in the blackboard 100 times and never forget.
The press is the enemy. I remember cupping my hand over my mouth and staring at my computer after hearing this audio for the first time. And the only word that flashed in my mind was unhinged. Nixon was deeply unhinged. And that was dangerous back then. And truly, unfortunately, it represents the danger that we're all experiencing today. This clip embodied the absurdity of the Nixon administration, Nixon's debilitating paranoia, and his pettiness. 6 months later, one member of the press learned that this message of the press being the enemy was explicitly personal to him as he covered the Senate Watergate hearings live on air for CBS. On June 27, 1973, White House counsel John Dean testified that the Nixon White House had compiled an enemies list, and the list was included in the evidence presented to the Senate committee. In a memo dated August 16, 1971, with the subject line, quote, "Dealing with our political enemies," Dean wrote that the enemies are, quote, "persons known to be active in their opposition to our administration." And the goal was, quote, "stated a bit more bluntly, how can we use the available federal machinery to screw our political enemies?" Flashback to June 27, 1973, when news of this list was made public, a copy of the list was circulated among the press. There were 20 people on the list, including CBS reporter and journalist Daniel Shore, who was covering the Senate hearing on air live as he read the list, and he paused when he saw his own name. Listen to how Shore described the moment during an interview with the Television Academy Foundation.
I was outside, along with Douglas Kiker of NBC and Sam Donaldson of ABC, each talking into his own camera, talking about these enemies list, but we didn't have any names. And I could hear in my ear from my producer back at CBS, "Get names, who, what?" And eventually, as we were talking, somebody came up and handed each of us a list. I was on the air live. I didn't have time to look at this document before I started reading it live. And so I said, "Oh, here is the first of the there are numbered 20 names numbered, and let's see, it is from John Dean to H.R. Haldeman, subject on screwing our political enemies." And I began to read down the list until I came to number 17. And 17, Daniel Shore. Notation, a real media enemy. And then I don't know how I looked at it. I've never seen the tape, but I felt as though I was going to gulp and collapse. But I did manage to say number 18, Paul Newman, number 19, Mary McGrory, number 20, and now back to you. And broke into a big sweat. The idea of becoming that I was a part of the story that I was covering was really quite incredible.
Y'all, I have been in a lot of breaking news scenarios that require alertness and a high level of mental agility that's deeply intense, but none of those moments had anything to do with me. So I fully believe it when Shore said that he felt like he was about to collapse. Honestly, adrenaline is probably the only thing that kept him together in that moment as he read his name, the names of other members of the press, actors, elected officials, union leaders, and donors. Listed beside Daniel Shore were Congressman Ron Dellums of California and John Conyers of Michigan, Ed Guthman, managing editor of the LA Times, Mary McGrory, columnist for the Washington Post, then the Washington Times-Herald, actor Paul Newman, and Samuel M. Lambert, president of the National Education Association. And Shore wasn't exaggerating about the notations beside each name. Shore was described as a, quote, real media enemy. McGrory's note only said, quote, daily hate Nixon articles. Paul Newman was described as, quote, radic lib causes, heavy McCarthy involvement in 68, used effectively in nationwide TV commercials, 72 involvement, certain. And the note for the president of the National Education Association was, quote, has taken us on vis-a-vis federal aid to parochial schools, a 72 issue. Those last two notes effectively capture the source of Nixon's fear and rage. He was afraid of his chances in his 1972 re-election bid, and he considered funding parochial schools to be a top issue for him, which is in part why Daniel Shore was on the list. But to be clear, fear of losing an election is not a reason to write an enemies list or to deploy the FBI to find dirt on your targets. And yes, I say that in a midterm year with an unhinged president who is scared of losing an election. As part of his work on CBS, Daniel Shore filed reports and offered additional on-air commentary, including commentary about a speech Nixon made to the Knights of Columbus in New York City on August 17, 1971, in which he promised to support more government funding for Catholic parochial schools. According to Shore's reflections featured in the Washington Post, then the Washington Times-Herald, in December 1973, during his reporting, Shore noted that given the Supreme Court rulings against federal funding for these schools, there was actually nothing for President Nixon to do in this scenario. Apparently, that enraged Nixon, and Shore was summoned to the White House for a dressing down by White House aides on August 19, 1971. Shore wrote, quote, my sin then had been reporting that punctured a public relations posture. It was reporting that often seemed to irk the administration more than commentary. After this White House meeting, Shore believes that Nixon ordered the FBI investigation, and that investigation turned out to be such a heavy-handed inquiry that it leaked to the press and required a cover-up. From the moment J. Edgar Hoover received the order from the White House to investigate Daniel Shore on August 19th, the FBI conducted 25 interviews within 7 hours. 25! Those interviews included Shore's family, his friends, his neighbors, even his colleagues at CBS. And according to the FBI archives, it was listed as a special inquiry that, quote, the president has requested extremely expedited investigation of Shore, who is being considered for presidential appointment. Position not stated. Do not indicate White House interest to persons contacted. Nixon wanted dirt, and fast. But the thing is, in all of the FBI interviews, no one had any. An interview report with a contact at the Christian Science Monitor said that he has never heard anything derogatory about Shore. His military record showed a good conduct medal and excellent ratings. One interview subject described Shore as a, quote, top-notch person in every respect. Then, the next day, August 20th, the FBI archives include an urgent memo from J. Edgar Hoover with the explicit instruction to, quote, discontinue the investigation immediately. Once the FBI got in contact with CBS personnel for interviews, Shore told his colleagues that he had no idea that he was being considered for any appointment with the federal government. Apparently, in their efficiency, the FBI did too good a job with their investigation, and red flags were being set off. Now, all of this happened in the course of 2 days in August 1971, all because Richard Nixon was upset at Shore's comments on air. According to the FBI archives, Shore had the wherewithal to alert his colleagues that he didn't know what position the FBI was investigating him for, and to pause responding to the FBI until he got more information. Then came the news reports, and yet another cover-up from the Nixon administration. The official cover was that the White House was considering Daniel Schorr for a high-level job in the environmental area, according to the FBI agent who interviewed Schorr. But by November 1971, Schorr expressed that he believed that there was never a job to be offered, and the White House refused to name the position. Still, Nixon's aides maintained that this was not an attempt at intimidation. 2 years later, Schorr read his own name on the enemies list on live television. Considering his knowledge of the FBI investigation, his spats with the Nixon administration about his coverage on CBS, and his belief that there was never any job that he was being offered by the White House, it's not clear why Schorr was extremely shocked that his name was on the enemies list, or that an enemies list was in the bounds of the pettiness and paranoia that was trademark of the Nixon administration. But many of us can relate to the gap between idea and reality. And that confirmation in June 1973 most certainly overwhelmed him. Before we close out this episode, I want to share some of the research that nearly got left on the cutting room floor. It's time for my favorite segment, One Last Nugget. And y'all, this one is a wild ride. On March 8th, 1971, Muhammad Ali fought Joe Frazier at Madison Square Garden in New York City, while 4 anti-war activists broke into the FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania, and walked out with more than 1,000 documents. According to a report by WHYY NPR Network, a total of 8 members of the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI were involved in planning the action, as they call it. And the Ali-Frazier fight provided excellent cover for the group because the building manager was listening to the fight on the radio and he couldn't even hear them prying open a deadbolt on the door to the FBI office. The documents that they released to the press revealed the inner workings of COINTELPRO and the FBI's unconstitutional surveillance practices of civil rights leaders, feminist organizers, anti-war activists, and apparently every single Black student on the campus of Swarthmore College. But the files almost didn't see the light of day. While they mailed the FBI records to 2 members of Congress, the New York Times, the LA Times, and the Washington Post, everyone except Betty Metzger at the Washington Post, who was also a local of Pennsylvania, promptly sent the records back to the FBI. The Attorney General ordered the editor, Ben Bradley, not to publish and to return the files to the FBI. According to Betty Metzger, Bradley remained firm and published under the premise that this was important public information and that national security would not be sacrificed. That same logic would be applied to publishing the Pentagon Papers only 3 months later, and to the Watergate investigation 2 years later. Here's a clip of John Raines, one of the activists involved in the action, during an interview with Democracy Now! In 2014 when the burglars revealed their identities for the first time, 42 years after they robbed the FBI.
The problem was J. Edgar Hoover was untouchable. He was a national icon. I mean, he had presidents who were afraid of him. The people that we had elected to oversee J. Edgar Hoover's FBI were either enamored of him or terrified of him. Nobody was holding him accountable. And that meant that somebody had to get objective evidence of what his FBI was doing. And that led us to the idea that Bill Avedon suggested to us. Let's break into an FBI office, get their files, and get what they're doing in their own handwriting.
John Raines' statements harken back to Roosevelt going along with Hoover's push to investigate and charge Black newspapers and journalists with sedition in the 1940s. It even connects to Nixon leveraging Hoover's rabid investigative senses and resources as a weapon against a journalist who he deemed to be an enemy. It's all connected, even to today. And it paints a picture of how people in power will abuse that power simply because they want to, and because they believe that they can get away with it. Thank you for watching Archival. Everything about this episode felt current, even though some of the archival records and sources were more than 80 years old. And there were critical lessons, including identifying information and news sources that are trustworthy. Today, that often looks like independent media outlets, as well as identifying your community to fight against oppressive forces. Now, that community could be the colleagues who are collectively standing up to government threats or activists who are taking action. There's value in community no matter what it looks like. If you enjoyed listening to this episode, please subscribe and rate Archival wherever you get your podcasts. Archival is a production of J. Tolliver Media, LLC.